Welcome back. Episode 4. And we are back on the Holocaust. So I'm reading it again. I know that this is a rather offensive title. I did not title the book. I did not write the book. I am simply allowing myself to consume the contents of the book and consider it. I want to say that I did not arrive at my interest of World War II and the Holocaust questioning the narrative or as a revisionist, and certainly not as a denier. I arrived at the question of revision because of my interest in World War II and the Holocaust. And at first, I'll admit, it was like hearing a different language. And particularly when watching documentaries, amateur documentaries about the Holocaust, hearing people use, because there are definitely people motivated in this because of racial discrimination, racism, and hearing people use racial slurs when making amateur documentaries or titling their little short films really disgusts me. Okay, I'm not racist. If I were to find out that the Holocaust never happened at all, I would not change my opinion about Jewish people. I am not a white supremacist. If I was, my wife would kill me. My wife is Haitian. She's not white. So, but I want to read something here. This is in reference to, we talked about Zyklon B being a pesticide, and that Zyklon means cyclone. It's a cyclone for pests like lice. And so piles of canisters may not mean that they were used to gas Jewish people. That it could mean that it was used very frequently to disinfect clothing. And we talked about piles of clothes, piles of hair, piles of Zyklon B canisters. So this, I felt, was relative to something that we had talked about. I'm going to read from the book here, a short section. Bear with me. I'm tired and I'm not very good. And this guy's style of writing, just for whatever reason, it's more difficult for me to read sometimes. Just not very good at reading out loud. So, bear with me. The major cause of deaths at Belsen was a typhus epidemic. Everybody agrees that typhus was a constant menace in all German camps and Eastern military operations. For this reason, there was a real fear of typhus spreading throughout Germany, and vigorous countermeasures were applied. The typhus problem will play a most significant role in our story because it was not merely at the end of the war that it manifested itself. The scenes at the end of the war were due to the total collapse of all measures against a disease that had plagued the German concentration camps since early in the war. The typhus was of the sort carried by body louse, and consequently defensive measures consisted in killing the lice, whose spread was due mainly to the constant rail traffic with the East. Thus, all survivor literature, sincere or inventive, and regardless of the type of camp involved, report the same basic procedure involved in entering a German camp. Disrobe, shave hair, shower, dress in new clothes or in old clothes after disinfection before entering the camp. At Belsen, the trouble had started in October 1944 with a breakdown of these measures in the account of a political prisoner there. So I'm going to... Towards the end of February 1945, my own situation changed completely. By the time typhus had become a serious danger for the whole camp, it was the species of the typhus which is transmitted by lice. At one time, all the transports which arrived at Belsen had to pass through a human laundry, and this disinfection seems to have been effective enough to keep the camp free from lice until autumn of 1944. At the end of October, a big transport had for the first time been admitted to the camp without being disinfected because there had been some damage to the machinery of the shower bath. Unfortunately, the people of this transport were louse carriers, and from that day the lice gradually spread over the entire camp. Typhus broke out in Camp 1 about the end of January. At first, there were only a few cases, but a month later a dozen had appeared, and it became impossible to check the disease. Another serious complication was that in the final months, Belsen was considered a Krankenlager, a sick camp, so that many people entering the camp to begin with were sick. The British could not check things at once, and over a quarter of those alive when they took over the camp were to perish in the first 4 weeks. Is that proof? I would say that is evidence. You'll also notice, to be fair, that the personal account, a name is not given. It just says that it was a political prisoner, which could have been a Jewish prisoner. Because remember, many of the Jews in Germany were communists. The Bolshevik Revolution was, to my knowledge, in large, a communist revolution. I may learn differently. I may be presented with information that tells me otherwise. I should say, I'm really not political. I follow politics, geopolitics, but I'm not fascist, I'm not communist, I'm not socialist, I'm not Republican or Democrat. I consider myself an independent, probably a conservative independent, the older I get particularly. But, the older I get, the less political I become. Particularly the more I learn about history and the trouble that politics brings to the world. Okay, so there's another testimony here, and this is in regards to the ovens at Dachau. So I will say that thus far, again, and when I read this book 3 years ago, there was a good portion of it. I would read a little bit and then I'd do something. It took me a while to finish the book. I wasn't as focused, which is why I'm going back to read it again. But it does not deny that atrocities were committed against the Jews. It does not deny that Jews were rounded up. It really doesn't deny the Holocaust. One of the main points of this book is the number that were killed and whether or not they were gassed, and whether or not there was a final solution to try to exterminate the Jews. So, having said that, I'm going to read a short portion here. The Americans brought the camp under control, and it served, as we have seen, as an American camp and center of war crime trials. As an American lawyer, Stephen S. Pinter, who was stationed there and eventually disapproved of what had been carried out at this camp in the name of the United States, wrote in 1959 this, and this is his testimony. I was in Dachau for 17 months after the war as a U.S. War Department attorney, and can state that there was no gas chamber at Dachau. What was shown to visitors and sightseers there and erroneously described as a gas chamber was a crematory. Nor was there a gas chamber in any of the other concentration camps in Germany. We were told that there was a gas chamber at Auschwitz, but since that was in the Russian zone of operation, we were not permitted to investigate, since the Russians would not permit it. Uses the old propaganda myth that millions of Jews were killed in the by the National Socialists. From what I was able to determine during 6 post-war years in Germany and Austria, there were a number of Jews killed, but the figure of 1 million was certainly never reached. I interviewed thousands of Jews, former inmates of concentration camps in Germany and Austria, and consider myself as well qualified as any man on this subject. So I will just, like I said with the last testimony, that, a name was not given. Was it completely fabricated? That, of course, is entirely possible. It would be harder to believe that this was completely fabricated, since also it is to my knowledge that there was not one German document to prove that there was a final solution to exterminate the Jews, and that kind of came up in my research of the Nuremberg trials, that the Nuremberg trials relied on almost solely on personal accounts and testimonies, whether it was from a victim, a Jewish victim, or an officer of the Nazi Party, the Nazi military. But this does give a name. Stephen S. Pinter, if that's how you pronounce it, Pinter, who was a War Department attorney. So that is a little bit more, I would say that qualifies a little bit more as evidence. Is that proof? Well, I don't know that I could call that proof. But I would say that is, in the court of law, that would be for sure evidence, strong evidence. I suppose it would probably depend on how well you were able to substantiate that claim with other accounts and or physical evidence. I found it pretty interesting when he said, I interviewed thousands of Jews, former inmates of concentration camps in Germany and Austria, and consider myself as well qualified as any man on this subject. And this is somebody that was, I would say probably it would not be too hard through military records to prove whether or not this person was in Dachau for 17 months after the war as a U.S. War Department attorney. But a lot of the evidence and proof given for the narrative that these were strictly death camps were testimonies of inmates. So if this guy interviewed thousands of Jews and he is stating that there was no gas chambers, that's interesting to me. These are the things that, as I heard, well, I didn't buy a revisionist or denial book. I, surfing the internet, came across documentaries that talked about some of this wild stuff to me. I thought, give me a break. I mean, I had just spent years watching the History Channel where they just, like I said, Hitler, Nazis, Holocaust, World War II, Hitler, Nazis, Holocaust, World War II, just hounded it into me, one specific narrative, and I never questioned it. And so when I watched documentaries where they would make these claims and then cite books and raise just some really interesting questions that it seemed like if you did some investigation on it, you would be able to tell whether or not this was true. And so I started down that road, you might call rabbit hole, and ended up with books like this. There's a gentleman by the name of Ernst Zundler who died in 2017. I'm not going to say that I share his philosophy to life. I have heard him say, I think he's very easily, until you listen to the words he says, I think he was very easily misunderstood as an anti-Semite and might have been, and or a Nazi, a white supremacist. From what I understand, he was not a white supremacist. He was a self-admitted pacifist. He was German-born and moved to Canada, refused German military service because he was a pacifist. I mean, that's what he says. Was not a denier, but a revisionist, in his words, and was not an anti-Semite. Though, particularly at the time, when I first got on to watching some interviews with him, I would have guessed so. And that's in the eye of the beholder too. What qualifies somebody as an anti-Semite may be different from one person to the next. But he had some really interesting, and if nothing else, if I, maybe we don't share the same life philosophy, maybe he is an anti-Semite, and I adamantly, strenuously object to any accusation of being an anti-Semite myself. He was a champion for free speech, which is a whole other issue, whether or not people agree on how the Holocaust happened or whether it happened or how many people died during the Holocaust. We have to have the right to debate it. That is what's most important. It boggles my mind to think, in Germany, this book is illegal. In Germany, this book could put me in prison. And I understand the sentiment some people may have in Europe about literature like this. But as an American and growing up in America, where I think we're losing we have not gained traction in our right to free speech. But I grew up in America where these books, I ordered this book and had it delivered to my house. American. I didn't worry about it being delivered by some kind of secret police and ended up in handcuffs. And so he was extradited because he was distributing literature by mail into Germany, this kind of literature, Holocaust revisionist literature, and extradited from, if I have this correctly, extradited from Canada to Germany, and I think served 4 or 5 years in prison for distributing literature like this. To me, that is horrible. I mean, I don't even know what word to describe it. To me, that is not justice. That is not the free world. That is not what we fought. I didn't. What Americans fought for, to liberate people in Germany, Jews and political prisoners and Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, Soviet war captives, prisoners of war. That just it boggles my mind to think that we won that war, quote unquote, liberated Germany, and that we don't have the right to question, that they don't have the right to question, and furthermore could extradite somebody from another country, from Canada, and then ended up in a court case in Canada, which has similar constitutional rights to free speech, ended up in a long fought court case in Canada for claims that 6 million Jews did not die in World War II, which now, and this was, I believe that court case started in 1984. And now, after that, in fact, I believe that court case having something to do with why the number was revised at Auschwitz from over 4 million to somewhere between 1.1 and 1.5 million, of whom were mostly Jews. Again, whether it was 4 million or 1 million, horrible, absolutely horrible, grotesque. However they died, whether it was by disease, because they were interned in a camp, whether it was by starvation, because they were starved or the Allied forces had cut off supply lines, or whether it was by gas. That's horrific. That's disgusting. That something like that can happen for whatever reason. But he fought. He became a champion and a warrior for free speech. I will say that. So, rest in peace, Zundel. It was your life, and your battle was not for nothing. And as far as I know, I just want to say that I don't believe Zundel was a white supremacist. I'm confident he wasn't a white supremacist. I've heard him say in an interview that he thought that there were some really wonderful, very intelligent Jewish people in the world, and that he does not blame Jewish people for lying about what happened in what he believed did or did not happen. So I'll just say that. I'm not really here as a spokesman for Ernst Zundel, but I have learned some things from him, and he has raised some interesting questions. If nothing else, he was an interesting person and a historian. So, we will continue on with this subject, and I can only imagine, I'm only 50 some pages into this book again, and I can only imagine what questions will arise. Like, subscribe, please comment and let me know what your take is on this. If you have any questions, things I've left out, and or things that you think that you can correct or add to, please do. And until next time.